devil sat in hell and doubled himself up with pain because the monk Luther was courageous enough to encroach on the round world and to upset the old order of things. "Is it not sufficient," he screamed, "that it resounds from afar that the wicked one dares to venture an attack on the spiritual power? Must he also be bold enough to turn everything upside down in my own kingdom and dominion? By my grandmother, he has taken up a position and will rob hell if I do not oppose him by a greater power. And who will help me in this severe exigency when the world threatens to depart from its course?" Thus howled Satan, and flogged his brains in such a way as to make his black forehead the color of blood. At this juncture the serpent approached him, the old poisonous beast, who nearly burst his belly with malice, deceit, and cunning, and whispered softly a couple of words into his ear. The devil lost not a syllable in his innermost thoughts. Up he sprang, and the swollen breast was relieved, and his eye shone again with pleasure and lust. 9 months after that, a woman gave birth to a youngster whose name was Don Inigo de Loyola. So, welcome everybody to a new book reading from Joggler 66, Hour of the Truth. The introduction that you've just heard is taken from a book written by an author called Theodor Griesinger called The Jesuits. It's quite an old book. It's from the 19th century, I guess. It was published in the beginning of the 20th century. And as you heard, of course, it deals with Don Inigo de Loyola. And it deals with Martin Luther. Now the funny thing, of course, Griesinger was a German, and in German he wrote a poem, so it rhymes. It doesn't rhyme in this case, in the English case, but it gives you an idea of what this reading is all about, the secret history of the Jesuits. Luther and Don Inigo de Loyola were contemporaries. They lived at the same time, and both were quote-unquote possessed by a spirit. While Luther, after being an Augustinian monk, was saved by the Holy Spirit and worked for God, Don Inigo de Loyola was possessed by Satan's spirit and worked for Satan and founded the Order of the Jesuits, or La Compañía de Jesús, the Company of Jesus, or the Society of Jesus, as the Jesuits are also called today. And I will directly start and go into the reading of the secret history of the Jesuits from Edmond Paris in section 1, the founding of the Jesuit order. And I hope that you enjoy it as much listening as much as I enjoyed it reading. But keep in mind, we are speaking here about the enemy, the adversary not only of God, but at the same time living the enemy of Martin Luther spiritually. The one, Luther, who initiated the Reformation that set almost all of Europe free by giving them the Bible in their own language, and on the other hand, the founder of the Jesuit order, the Counter-Reformation that wanted to turn everything around again and give back the temporal and the spiritual power to the Pope, as if the Reformation never happened. The same goal they have today. But without any further ado, I go now to the book The Secret History of the Jesuits by Edmond Paris, Section 1, the founding of the Jesuit order. The founder of the Society of Jesus, the Spanish Basque Don Inigo López de Recalde, was born at the castle of Loyola in the province of Guipúzcoa in 1491. He was one of the strangest types of monk soldiers ever engendered by the Catholic world. Of all the founders of religious orders, he may be the one whose personality has left the strongest mark on the mind and behavior of his disciples and successors. This may be the reason for that familiar look, or trademark, a fact which goes as far as physical resemblance. Mr. Foley disputes this fact, but many documents prove the permanence of a Jesuit type through the ages. The most amusing of these testimonies is found at the Gimmet Museum. On the golden background of a 16th century screen, a Japanese artist portrayed with all the humor of his race the landing of the Portuguese, and of the sons of Loyola in particular, on the Nipponese islands. The amazement of this lover of nature and bright colors is obvious in the way he depicted those long black shadows with their mournful faces, on which is congealed all the arrogance of the fanatic ruler. The likeness between the work of the Oriental artist of the 16th century and our Daumier of 1830 is there for all to see. Like many other saints, Inigo, who later Romanized his name and became Ignatius, looked far from being the one predestined to enlighten his contemporaries. His stormy youth was filled with mistakes and even heinous crimes. A police report said that he was, quote, treacherous, brutal, vindictive, unquote. All his biographers admit that he yielded to none of his boon companions regarding the violence of the instincts than a common thing. Quote, an unruly and conceited soldier, said one of his confidants, he led a disorderly life as far as woman, gambling, and duels were concerned, unquote. Added his secretary Polenko. All this is related to us by one of his spiritual sons, R.P. Rouquette, who tried somewhat to explain and excuse this hot temper, which was eventually turned ad majorem Dei gloriam, which means to the greater glory of God. As it is written here, he led a disorderly life as far as woman, gambling, and duels were concerned. So we see where he comes from. And keep in mind that we are speaking about a contemporary of Martin Luther. What kind of life did he had in comparison to Ignatius of Loyola, huh? Being an Augustinian monk and a professor of canon law in Wittenberg, something quite different than what is stated here, a disorderly life leading with woman, gambling, and duels involved. Now, as is the case for many heroes of the Roman Catholic Church, a violent physical blow was necessary to change his personality. He had been page boy to the treasurer of Castile until his master's disgrace. Then he became a gentleman in the service of the Viceroy of Navarre. Having lived the life of a courtier until then, the young man started the life of a soldier by defending Pampeluna against the French commanded by the Count de Foix. The wound which decided his future life was inflicted during that siege. A leg broken by a bullet, he was taken by the victorious French to his brother Martin Garcia at the castle of Loyola. Now starts the martyrdom of surgery without anesthesia, through which he had to go a second time, as the work had not been done properly. So his leg was broken again and reset. In spite of all this, Ignatius was left with a limp. One can understand that he only needed an experience such as this to cause him a nervous breakdown. The quote-unquote gift of tears, which was then bestowed on him in abundance, and in which his pious biographers see a favor from on high, is maybe only the result of his highly emotional nature, henceforth to affect him more and more. His sole entertainment while lying, wounded in his pain, his sole entertainment while lying wounded and in pain, was the reading of the life of Christ and the life of the saints, the only books found in the castle. Well, the author says the only books found in the castle at that time were the life of Christ and the life of the saints, you also have to add here the Bible in Spanish, because that is something that we've learned when we read Rulers of Evil. But Ignatius chose not to read the Bible, but to read those secular works, Life of Christ and Life of the Saints. As he was practically uneducated and still affected by the terrible shock, the anguish of Christ's passion and the martyrdom of the saints had an indelible impact on him. This obsession led the crippled warrior on to the road of apostolate. Quote, "He put the books to one side and daydreamed. A clear case of the wakeful dream, this was a continuation into the adult years of the imaginary game of the child. If we let it invade the psychic realm, the result is neurosis and surrender of the will. That which is real takes second place." Unquote. Now, these quotes are taken from R.P. Jesuit Robert Rouquette from Saint Ignace de Loyola, the book published in Paris in 1944. At first sight, this diagnosis seems hardly to apply to the founder of such an active order, nor to other great mystics and creators of religious societies, all of whom had apparently great capacities for organization. But we find that all of them are unable to resist their overactive imaginations, and, for them, the impossible becomes possible. Here is what the same author says on this subject. Quote, "I want to point out the obvious outcome of the practice of mysticism by someone possessing a brilliant intelligence. The weak mind indulging in mysticism is on dangerous ground, but the intelligent mystic presents a far greater danger. Thus, his intellect works in a wider and deeper way. When the myth takes over from the reality in an active intelligence, it becomes mere fanaticism, an infection of the will which suffers from a partial enlargement or distortion." Unquote. Ignatius of Loyola was a first-class example of that active mysticism and distortion of will. Nevertheless, the transformation of the gentleman warrior into the general of the most militant order in the Roman Catholic Church was very slow. There were many faltering steps before he found his true vocation. It is not our intention to follow him through all those different stages. Let us recall the main points. In the spring of 1522 he left the ancestral castle, with his mind made up to become a saint similar to those whose edifying exploits he had been reading about in that big Gothic volume. Besides, did not the Madonna herself appear to him one night, holding in her arms the child Jesus? After a thorough confession at the monastery of Montserrat, he was planning to go to Jerusalem. The plague was rife in Barcelona, and as all maritime traffic had stopped, he had to stay at Manresa for nearly a year. There he spent his time in prayers, orisons, long fasts, flagellating himself, practicing all the forms of maceration, and never failing to appear before the tribunal for penance, even though his confession at Montserrat had apparently lasted 3 whole days. Such a thorough confession would have been sufficient to a less scrupulous sinner. All this depicts quite clearly the mental and nervous state of the man. At last delivered from that obsession of sin by deciding it was only a trick of Satan, he devoted himself entirely to the varied and plentiful visions which were haunting his feverish mind. It is because of a vision, says H. Boehmer, that he started eating meat again. It is a whole series of visions that revealed to him the mysteries of the Catholic dogma and helped him to truly live it. In that way, he meditates upon the Trinity in the shape of a musical instrument with 3 chords. The mystery of the creation of the world through something hazy and light coming out of a ray of sunshine. the miraculous descent of Christ into the Eucharist as flashes of light entering the consecrated water when the priest held it up while praying, the human nature of Christ and the Holy Virgin under the form of a dazzling white body, and finally Satan as a serpentine and shimmering shape similar to a multitude of sparkling and mysterious eyes." Unquote. Is not this the start of the well-known Jesuitic image-making? Spiritual exercises they use for that? Author Mr. Boehmer adds that the deep meaning of the dogmas was revealed to him as a special favor from on high, through transcendental intuitions. Quote, "Many mysteries of faith and science became suddenly clear to him, and later he pretended to have learned more in those short moments than during the whole of his studies. However, he was never able to explain what these mysteries were which suddenly became clear to him. There was only a hazy recollection left, a feeling of something miraculous, as if at that moment he had become another man with another intelligence." All this may be the result of a nervous disorder and can be identified with what happens to smokers of opium and eaters of hashish. That enlargement or extension of the ego, that illusion of soaring up beyond what is real, a flashing sensation leaving only a dazed recollection. Blissful visions and illuminations were constant companions of his mystic throughout his life. Quote, "He never doubted the reality of these revelations. He chased Satan with a stick as he would have done a mad dog. He talked to the Holy Spirit as one does to another person actually. He asked for the approval of God, the Trinity and the Madonna on all his projects, and would burst into tears of joy when they appeared to him. On those occasions he had a foretaste of celestial bliss. The heavens were open to him, and the Godhead was visible and perceptible to him." One can ask himself what Godhead is visible and perceptible to him. You know, the Bible says that we should check every spirit that comes into us, and he probably did not do that, because otherwise the Madonna would not have appeared to him, and all these Godheads visible and everything that he had, that is not the Spirit of God and of Jesus Christ. Well, is not this the perfect case of an hallucinated person, the author asks here? Well, I think that is more that of an hallucinated person than it has to do anything with divine revelation, right? It will be this same perceptible and visible Godhead that the spiritual sons of Loyola will constantly offer to the world, not only for political reasons, leaning on and flattering the deep-rooted inclination in the heart of man for idolatry, but also by conviction, having seen well and truly indoctrinated. From the start, medieval mysticism has prevailed in the society of Jesus. A very important sentence, understand that very well. From the start, medieval mysticism has prevailed in the society of Jesus, not divine revelation. It is still the great animator, in spite of its readily assumed worldly, intellectual, and learned aspects. Its basic axiom is, quote, "all things to all men." Very important sentence. A Jesuit has to be everything or everyone to everyone. They have to appear as all things to all men. This is even taken directly out from their fourth vow of induction. Its basic axiom is all things to all men. The arts, literature, science, and even philosophy have been mere means or nets to catch souls, like the easy indulgences granted by its casuists, and for which laxity they were so often reproved. To this order there is not a realm where human weakness cannot be worked upon, to incite the spirit and will to surrender and go back to a more childish and restful devotion. So they work for the bringing about of the quote-unquote kingdom of God according to their own ideal. A kingdom of God of their own ideal, not God's ideal. A great flock under the Holy Father's crosier. That learned men could have such an anachronic ideal seems very strange, yet it is undeniable so, and the confirmation of an oft disregarded fact. The preeminence of the emotions in the life of the spirit. Besides, Kant, the German philosopher, said that every philosophy is but the expression of the philosopher's temperament or character. Apart from individual methods, the Jesuitic temperament seems more or less uniform amongst them. A mixture of piety and diplomacy, asceticism and worldly wisdom, mysticism and cold calculation, as was Loyola's character, so is the trademark of his order. A mixture of piety and diplomacy, asceticism and worldly wisdom, mysticism and cold calculation, as was Loyola's character, so is the trademark of this order, the Society of Jesus, to the day. In the first place, every Jesuit chose this particular order because of his natural dispositions. But he really becomes a son of Loyola after rigorous tests and systematic training lasting no less than 14 years. We are talking here about 14 years of indoctrination, 14 years of spiritual exercises, brainwashing, giving up your own personality. In that way, the paradox of this order has continued for 400 years, an order which endeavors to be intellectual but simultaneously has always been within the Roman Catholic Church and society the champion of the strictest disposition. Looking into Chapter 2, the spiritual exercises. When the time came at last for Ignatius to leave Manresa, he couldn't foresee his destiny, but the anxiety concerning his own salvation was not his main concern any more. It is as a missionary, and not as a mere pilgrim, that he left for the Holy Land in March 1523. He arrived in Jerusalem on the 1st of September, after many adventures, only to leave again soon after on the orders of the Franciscan's provincial, who was not desirous to see the precarious peace between Christians and Turks endangered by an untimely proselytism. The disappointed missionary passed through Venice, Genoa, and Barcelona on his way to the University of Alcala, where he started theological studies, It is there also that his cure of souls amongst voluntary listeners began. Quote, "In these conventicles, the most common manifestations of piety amongst the fair sex were fainting fists. By that we realize how hard he applied his religious methods, and how such a fervent propaganda would soon arouse the curiosity and then the suspicions of the inquisitors." In April 1527, the Inquisition put Ignatius in prison to try him on the grounds of heresy. The inquiry examined those peculiar incidents amongst his devotees, the strange assertions of the accused concerning the wonderful power his chastity conferred on him, and his bizarre theories on the difference between mortal and venial sins. These theories had striking affinities with those of Jesuit casuists of the subsequent epoch. Released but forbidden to hold meetings, Ignatius left for Salamanca, and soon started the same activities. Similar suspicions amongst the inquisitors led to imprisonment again. Release was only on condition of desisting from such conduct. Thus it was he journeyed to Paris to continue his studies at the College of Montaigu. His efforts to indoctrinate his fellow students according to his peculiar methods brought him into trouble again with the Inquisition. Becoming more prudent, he met with just 6 of his college friends, 2 of which will become highly esteemed recruits, Salmeron and Lainez. What did he have in himself that so powerfully attracted young people to an old student? It was his ideal and a little charm he carried on himself. A small book, in fact a very minute book, which is, in spite of its smallness, amongst those which have influenced the fate of humanity. This volume has been printed so many times that the number of copies is unknown. It was also the object of more than 400 commentaries. It is the textbook of the Jesuits, and at the same time the resume of the long inner development of their master, the spiritual exercises. Mr. Boehmer says, quote, Ignatius understood more clearly than any other leader of men who preceded him that the best way to raise a man to a certain ideal is to become master of his imagination. We, quote, imbue into him spiritual forces which he would find very difficult to eliminate later, unquote. Forces more lasting than all the best principles and doctrines. These forces can come up again to the surface, sometimes after years not even mentioning them, and become so imperative that the will finds itself unable to oppose any obstacle and has to follow the irresistible impulse, unquote. Now, what Boehmer writes here in this book, what he just explained to us, forces more lasting than all the best principles and doctrines. That is to me, when you speak clear and true and plain, clear and plain English, that is to me the result of demon possession. Because this is actually nothing else that we speak about when we talk about this spiritual exercises. It means opening up your mind to all kind of spirits to enter and putting away anything of yourself thinking, and surely not the Holy Spirit opening that's something completely different, completely out of the question. No one ever who does this will open up himself to the Holy Spirit, but they will open up to other spirits, and they will even be possessed by them. And a very good example is that what he wrote here in the end, that he said, we imbue into him spiritual forces which you would find very difficult to eliminate later, and these forces can come up again to the surface sometimes after years of not even mentioning them. Have you ever heard of, what's it called, the Manchurian Candidate? These mind control games, these mind control, MK Ultra and other things? All this has to do with the spiritual exercises of the Jesuits. But let's continue reading. Thus all the truths of the Catholic dogma will have to be not only meditated, but lived and felt by the one who devotes himself to these exercises with the help of a director. In other words, he will have to see and relive the mystery with the greatest possible intensity. The candidate's sensitiveness becomes impregnated with these forces whose persistence in his memory, and even more so in his subconscious, will be as strong as the effort he made to evoke and assimilate them. Beside sight, the other senses, such as hearing, smell, taste, and touch, will play their part. In short, it is mere controlled autosuggestion. Have you ever heard of autosuggestive training and all that stuff? Now you have an idea where that all comes from. It all derives from Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises. In short, it is mere controlled autosuggestion. the angel's rebellion, Adam and Eve driven out of paradise, God's tribunal, the evangelical scenes and phases of the Passion are, as one would say, relived in front of the candidate. Sweet and blissful scenes alternate with the most somber ones at a skillfully arranged rhythm. No need to say that hell has the prominent part in that magic lantern show, with its lake of fire into which the damned are thrown, the awful concert of screams, the atrocious stench of sulphur and burning flesh. Yet Christ is always there to sustain the visionary who doesn't know how to thank him for not having thrown him already into hell to pay for his past sins. Here's what Edgar Quinet wrote. Quote, "Not only visions are prearranged, but also sighs, inhalings, breathing are noted down. The pauses and intervals of silence are written down like on a music sheet. In case you do not believe me, I will quote. The third way of praying by measuring the words and periods of silence. This particular manner of praying consists of leaving out some words between every breath, and a little further, quote, make sure to keep equal gaps between every breath and choking sob and word, unquote. Et paria anhelitium ac vocuum interstitia observet. Which means that the man, being inspired or not, becomes just a machine, which must sigh, sob, groan, cry, shout, or catch one's breath at the exact moment and in the order which experience shows to be the most profitable. Spiritual exercises. And you thought you knew it all, huh? It is understandable that after 4 weeks devoted to these intensive exercises with the director as his only companion, the candidate would be ripe for the subsequent training and breaking. This is what Quinet has to say when referring to the creator of such an hallucinatory method. Quote, "Do you know what distinguishes him from all the ascetics of the past? The fact that he could observe and analyze himself logically and coldly in that state of rapture, while for all the others even the idea of reflection was impossible. Imposing on his disciples actions which, to him, were spontaneous, he needed just 30 days to break, with this method, the will and reasoning in the manner in which a rider breaks his horse. He only needed 30 days, triginta dies, to subdue a soul." Note that Jesuitism expanded together with modern Inquisition. While the Inquisition dislocated the body, the spiritual exercises broke up the thoughts under Loyola's machine. Unquote. I find this very, very interesting to read. I don't know about you, but absolutely, spiritual exercises are there to break your mind, to make you subdue. That is why you read in the oath of the Jesuits that they will act as a cadaver, perende ac cadaver. They have no meaning, no conscience, nothing of their own. They're like a dead body. And this is exactly what is described here in the 30 days of spiritual exercises. He only needed 30 days to subdue a soul. Note that Jesuitism expanded together with modern Inquisition. While the Inquisition dislocated the body, the spiritual exercises broke up the thoughts under Loyola's machine. And then please understand that you didn't participate freely, from free will, in the Inquisition. No, you were tortured and killed there on orders of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, but you subdue yourself freely to the spiritual exercises. In any case, one could not examine his spiritual life too deeply, even without the honor of being a Jesuit. Loyola's methods are to be recommended to the faithful and ecclesiastics in particular, as we are reminded by commentators such as R.P. Pinard de la Bouille, author of Mental Prayer for All, inspired by Saint Ignatius. This very valuable aid for the soul would, we think, be more explicit if the title read Alienation instead of Prayer. We even come to Chapter 3 and Section 1 of the book The Secret History of the Jesuits, the founding of the company. The Society of Jesus was constituted on Assumption Day 1534 in the chapel of Notre Dame de Montmartre. Ignatius was then 44 years old. After communion, the animator and his companions vowed to go to the Holy Land as soon as their studies were finished to convert the infidels. But the following year found them in Rome, where the Pope, who was then organizing a crusade against the Turks with the German Emperor and the Republic of Venice, showed them how impossible their project was because of it. So Ignatius and his companions dedicated themselves to missionary work in Christian lands. In Venice, his apostolate aroused again the suspicions of the Inquisition. The constitution of the Company of Jesus was at last drafted and approved in Rome by Paul III in 1540, and the Jesuits put themselves at the disposition of the Pope, promising him unconditional obedience, perende ac cadaver. Teaching, confession, preaching and charitable work were the field of the action for this new order, but foreign missions were not excluded, as in 1541 Francis Xavier and 2 companions left Lisbon to go and evangelize the Far East. In 1546 the political side of their career was launched, when the Pope chose Lainez and Salmeron to represent him at the Council of Trent in the capacity of pontifical theologians. Mr. Boehmer writes, quote, "Then the order was employed by the Pope only on a temporary basis. But it performed its functions with so much promptitude and zeal that already under Paul III it had implanted itself very firmly into all chosen kinds of activities, and won the confidence of the Curia for all time." Unquote. This confidence was fully justified. The Jesuits, and Lainez in particular, together with their devoted friend Cardinal Moroni, became the cunning and untiring champions of pontifical authority and intangibility of the dogma during the 3 sessions of that council ending in 1562. By their clever maneuvers and dialectics, they succeeded in defeating the opposition and all heretic claims, including marriage of priests, communion with the 2 elements, use of the vernacular in services, and especially reform of the papacy. Only the reform of convents was retained on the agenda. Lainez himself, by a forceful counterattack, upheld pontifical infallibility, which was promulgated 3 centuries later by the Vatican Council in 1870. The Holy See emerged strengthened from the crisis where it nearly foundered, thanks to the steadfast actions of the Jesuits. The terms chosen by Paul III to describe this new order in his bull of authorization were then amply justified. Regimini Ecclesiae Militantis. The fighting spirit developed more and more as time went on. Besides foreign missions, the activities of Loyola's sons started to concentrate on the souls of men, especially amongst ruling classes. Politics are their main field of action, as all of the efforts of these directors concentrate on one aim: the submission of the world to the papacy, and to attain this the heads must be conquered first. And to realize this ideal, 2 very important weapons: to be the confessors of the mighty and those in high places, and the education of their children. In that way, the present will be safe while the future is prepared. The Holy See realized the strength this new order would bring. At first, the number of its members had been limited to 60, but this restriction was promptly lifted. When Ignatius died in 1556, his sons were working amongst pagans in India, China, Japan, the New World, but also and especially in Europe, France, southern and western Germany, where they fought against the heresy. In Spain, Portugal, Italy, and even England, getting in by way of Ireland. Their history, full vicissitudes, will be of a Roman network they will constantly try to spread over the world, whose links will be forever torn and mended. We go into the next section, the spirit of the order. Very interesting to follow. Let us not forget is a quote from Jesuit Roquette. Let us not forget, writes the Jesuit Roquette, that historically ultramontanism has been the practical affirmation of universalism. This necessary universalism would be an empty word if it did not result in a practical cohesion or obedience of Christianity. This is why Ignatius wanted this theme to be the disposition of the Pope and be the champion of the Catholic unity, unity which can be assured only through an effective submission to Christ's vicar. The Jesuits wanted to impose this monarchical absolutism on the Roman Catholic Church, and they maintained it in civil society as they had to look upon the sovereigns as temporal representatives of the Holy Father, true head of Christianity, as long as those monarchs were entirely docile to their common lord. The Jesuits were their most faithful supporters. On the other hand, if these princes rebelled, they found in the Jesuits their worst enemies. You remember that saying from the Oath of the Jesuits, the abbreviation INRI, something you've already learned in earlier readings of me. It says INRI, INRI, Justrum Nica Regis Impius, the meaning of which is, it is just to exterminate or annihilate impious or heretical kings, governments, or rulers. Exactly what I was just reading to you right here. The Jesuits were their most faithful supporters. On the other hand, if these princes rebelled, they found in the Jesuits their worst enemies. In Europe, wherever Rome's interests required the people to rise against their king, or if these temporal princes had taken decisions embarrassing for the Church, the Curia knew she would not find more able, more cunning or daring outside the Society of Jesus when it came to intrigue, propaganda, or even open rebellion. We have seen through the spirit of the exercises how the founder of this company was behind his time in his simplistic mysticism, ecclesiastic discipline, and, generally speaking, his conception of subordination. The constitutions and exercises, fundamentals to this system, leave us without any doubt on that subject. No matter what his disciples may say, especially today as modern ideas on the subject are totally different, obedience has a very special place, in fact, incontestably the first in the summary of the order's rules. Mr. Folliet may pretend to see in it nothing more than, quote, religious obedience, unquote, necessary to any congregation. R.P. Roquette writes boldly, quote, far from being a diminution of man, this intelligent and willing obedience is the height of freedom, a liberation from oneself from oneself's bondage, unquote. One only has to read those texts to perceive the extreme, if not monstrous, character of this submission of soul and spirit imposed to the Jesuits, making them always docile instruments in their superiors' hands, and even more from their very beginning the natural enemies of any kind of liberty. The famous perende ac cadaver, what I was speaking already earlier of, as a corpse in the undertaker's hands, can be found in all spiritual literature, according to Mr. Folliot, and even in the East in the Hachichin's constitution. The Jesuits are to be in the hands of their superiors, quote, as a staff obeying every impulse, as a ball of wax which can be shaped and stretched in any direction, as a small crucifix being lifted and moved at will. These pleasant formulas are nonetheless very enlightening. Remarks and explanations from the creator of his order leave us without any doubt as to their true meaning. Besides, amongst the Jesuits not only the will, but also reasoning and even moral scruple must be sacrificed to the primordial virtue of obedience, which is, according to Borgia, the strongest rampart of society. This is a very good explanation of what perinde ac cadaver actually is. Not only the will, but also reasoning and even moral scruple must be sacrificed to the primordial virtue of obedience. Perende ac cadaver, as a corpse in the undertaker's hands, according to Borgia, which is the strongest rampart of society. Let us be convinced that all is well and right when the superior commands it, wrote Loyola. And again, even if God gave you an animal without sense for master, you will not hesitate to obey him as master and guide, because God ordained it so to be, ordained it to be so, unquote. Now, the question is, what God is he talking about? And I don't think that this is the God of the Bible, the God of Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that we Bible-believing Christians believe in. And something even better. The Jesuit must see in his superior not a fallible man, but Christ himself. Something that also I read already in the book Rulers of Evil. The Jesuits even have to accept the Black Pope, the general of the society as Jesus, as a vicar of Christ. So within the Roman Catholic Church you actually have two so-called vicars of Christ, the White Pope and the Black Pope. Even if God, and something even better, the Jesuit must see in his superior not a fallible man, but Christ himself. J. Huber, professor of Catholic theology in Munich and author of one of the most important works on the Jesuits, wrote, quote, "Here is a proven fact. The constitutions repeat 500 times that one must see Christ in the person of the general," unquote. Taken from Huber's book Les Jésuites, meaning the Jesuits, from 1875. The discipline of the order, assimilated so often to that of the army, is then nothing compared to the reality. Quote, "Military obedience is not the equivalent of Jesuitic obedience. The latter is more extensive, and it gets hold of the whole man and is not satisfied like the other with the exterior act, but requires the sacrifice of the will and laying aside of one's own judgment." Unquote. Ignatius himself wrote in his letter to the Portuguese Jesuits, quote, "We must see black as white if the Church says so." Unquote. Such is the height of freedom and liberation from one's own bondage, praised earlier by R.P. Raquette. Indeed, the Jesuit is truly liberated from himself, as he is totally subjected to his masters. Any doubt or scruple would be imputed to him as sin. Mr. Boehmer writes, quote, "In the additions to the constitutions, the superiors are advised to command the novices, as God did with Abraham, things apparently criminal to prove them, but they must proportion these temptations to each one's strength. It is not difficult to imagine what could be the results of such an education." Unquote. The order's life of ups and downs, there is not one country from which it wasn't expelled, testifies that these dangers were recognized by all governments, even the most Catholic ones. By introducing men so blindly devoted to their cause to teaching among the higher classes, the company, champion of universalism, therefore ultramontanism, was inevitably recognized as a threat to civil authority, as the activity of the order, by the mere fact of the vocation, turned more and more towards politics. In a parallel way, what we call the Jesuitic spirit was developing amongst its members. Nevertheless, the founder, inspired mainly by the needs of foreign and home missions, had not neglected skillfulness. He wrote in his Centenae Asceticae, quote, "A clever carefulness together with a mediocre purity is better than a greater holiness coupled with a less perfect skillfulness. A good shepherd of souls must know how to ignore many things and pretend not to understand them. Once he is master of the wills, he will be able wisely to lead his students wherever he may choose. People are entirely absorbed by passing interests, so we must not speak to them too pointedly about their souls. It would be throwing the hook without the bait." Unquote. Even the desired countenance of Loyola's sons was emphatically stated, quote, "They must hold their heads slightly down, without bending it to the left or right. They must not look up when they speak to someone. They are not to look them straight in the eyes, so as they see them only indirectly." Unquote. Loyola's successors retained this lesson well in their memory and applied it very extensively in the pursuit of their plans. So we come now to Chapter 5, the privileges of the company. After 1558, Lainez, the subtle tactician of the Council of Trent, was made general of the congregation with the power to organize the order as he was inspired. The declarations, which he himself composed with Salmeron, were added to the constitutions to form a commentary. They accentuated even more the despotism of the general elected for life. An admonitor, procurator, and assistants residing in Rome too will help him generally to administer the order, divided then into 5 congregations: Italy, Germany, France, Spain, England, and America. Well, if I can count correctly, these are 6, right? Italy, Germany, France, Spain, England, and America. I count 6. So, even though it says here into 5 congregations, probably Italy and Germany were together in one. These congregations were themselves divided into provinces, grouping the different establishments of the order. Only the admonitor, or overseer, and assistants are nominated by the congregation. The general appoints all other officials, promulgates with ordinances which are not to modify the constitutions, administers the wealth of the order according to his own wishes, and directs its activities, for which he is responsible to the Pope only. To this militia, so tightly knit in the land of its chief and which needs the greatest autonomy to make its actions effective, the Pope concedes privileges which may seem exorbitant to other religious orders. By their constitutions, the Jesuits were exempt from cloistered rule which applied to monastic life in general. In fact, they are monks living, quote, "in the world," unquote, and outwardly nothing distinguishes them from the secular clergy. But, contrary to this and other religious congregations, they are not subjected to the bishop's authority. As early as 1545, a bull of Paul III enabled them to preach, hear confession, dispense the sacraments, and say Mass, in short, exercise their ministry without having to refer to the bishop. The solemnization of marriages is the only thing they are not allowed to perform. They have the power to give absolution, change vows for others which are easier to fulfill, or even cancel them. Mr. Gaston Belli writes, quote, "The general's power concerning absolution and dispensations is even wider. He can lift all punishment inflicted on the members of the society before or after them entering the order, absolve all their sins, even the sin of heresy and schism, the falsification of apostolic writings, etc. The general absolves in person or through a delegate all those who are under his obedience of the unhappy state arising from excommunication, suspension, or interdict, provided the censures were not inflicted, or excesses so enormous that others, beside the papal tribunal, knew about them. He also absolves the irregularity issuing from bigamy, injuries done to others, murder, assassination, as long as these wicked deeds were not publicly known and the cause of a scandal." Unquote. Finally, Gregory XIII, Antichrist Pope Gregory XIII, that is, bestowed on the company the right to deal in commerce and banking, a right it made use of extensively later on. Yeah, the Jesuits are the revived Knights Templars. So finally Gregory XIII bestowed on the company the right to deal in commerce and banking, a right it made use of extensively later on. When the Knights Templars were forbidden, they were the money masters of the world in 1307. And the Jesuits just took that over. And proof of that today is that the Jesuits, through the Knights of Malta, control the complete financial system of the world. The Federal Reserve System in the United States of America, but the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, all is theirs. And with their frontmen that catch the fire, the Rothschilds, which are the guardians of the Vatican treasure, they have, with the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, the mother bank of all banks, the central bank of central banks, under their power. So Gregory XIII bestowed on the company the right to deal in commerce and banking, a right it made use of extensively later on, and surely today, 2016. These dispensations and unprecedented powers were fully guaranteed to them. Quote, "The popes called even upon princes and kings to defend these privileges. They threatened with the great excommunication latae sententiae all those who would try to infringe them. In 1574, a bull of Pius V gave the general the right to restore these privileges to their original scope, against all attempts to alter or curtail them, even if such curtailments were authoritatively documented by papal revocation. By granting the Jesuits such exorbitant privileges, which run counter to the Church's antiquated constitution, the papacy wanted not only to supply them with powerful weapons to fight the infidels, but especially use them as a bodyguard to defend her own unrestricted power in the Church and against the Church. To preserve the spiritual and temporal supremacy they usurped during the Middle Ages, the popes sold the Church to the order of Jesus and, in consequence, surrendered themselves into their hands. If the papacy was supported by the Jesuits, the whole existence of the Jesuits depended on the spiritual and temporal supremacy of the papacy. In that way, the interests of both parties were intimately bound together." Unquote. But this select cohort needed secret auxiliaries to dominate civil society. This role fell on those affiliated to the company called Jesuits. Quote, "Many important people were connected in that way with the society. The Emperors Ferdinand II and Ferdinand III, Sigismund III, King of Poland, who had officially belonged to the company, Cardinal Infant, a Duke of Savoy, and these were not the least useful." Unquote. It is the same today. The 33,000 official members of the Society of Jesus operate all over the world in the capacity of her personnel, officers of a truly secret army containing in its ranks heads of political parties, high-ranking officials, generals, magistrates, physicians, faculty professors, etc., all of them striving to bring about in their own sphere a Opus Dei, God's work, in reality the plans of the papacy, the plans of the Antichrist of the Bible, what the papacy actually is. That is what it is all about. So to sum up a little bit, we see how the Jesuit order, after being ordained by Pope Paul III as Regimini Militantis Ecclesiae in 1540, worked all the time through their spiritual exercises to take control of the complete curia of the complete Roman Catholic Church. And here you already see, when you read between the lines what I just read to you, that what is called the program of the Society of Jesus. The Church to rule the world, the Pope to rule the Church, the Jesuits to rule the Pope. Such was and is the program of the Order of the Society of Jesus. That was a quote from the book The Grand Design Exposed, chapter 6, for everyone who wants to trace that down where that comes from. And this finishes section 1 and the first 5 chapters of the book The Secret History of the Jesuits. We will continue next time with section 2, The Jesuits in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. And very interesting history that you probably have not heard or learned during your school time or universal time, your university time, or wherever you studied. So, thank you very much for watching and listening. Until next time, God bless you, and Joggler66 from Hour of the Truth signing off, saying bye-bye.
Especially I work in dealing with the infiltration of churches and religious institutions as well as government. That cover a tremendous number of institutions.
And the purpose of that infiltration was what for?
Well, the purpose is what the Roman Catholic system has all the time as her own purpose, is to infiltrate, to penetrate all the areas of life where the Roman Catholic can have control and access for the coming world government.
Simply put, this country and this world benefit from your commitment to Jesuit principles, to being men.
As a graduate of another great Jesuit institution, Xavier University, I have great affection for the value and purpose of a Jesuit education.
What that means is, in preparation for that world government, the Roman Catholic institution, especially since the establishment of the Jesuit order in 1541, throughout all these 500 years, they've been in preparation and through infiltration and penetration of every level of society in order to take over the world politically and religiously.
What a beautiful day the Lord has made. Holy Father, on behalf of Michelle and myself, welcome to the White House.
There are two doctrines that define very well these dangerous goals of the Roman Catholic institution. Two doctrines define this very well. One is called the doctrine of the apostolic succession, and that is dealing with the papacy. And the other is the doctrine, the temporal power, and that is dealing with world government. Of course, both, because you can see that even the Pope and his own individual office, he meet those requirements. He is not only the head of his church, as he called himself, John Paul II, the present Pope. He said he is the pastor of his church. He is not only that, but he is the head of his state.
It is a sign, perhaps, of how far we have come in this country that today's news of formal recognition between the governments of the United States and the Vatican did not create a furor. Once upon a time, it would have. Once upon a time, and not all that long ago, it did.
From the time of President Washington, there was the first president to be utilized by the Jesuits. If you were not aware of that, President Washington already was initiated by the Jesuits to bring about the first communication with the Vatican ever known in this country. From there on, President Reagan, to all this time, President Reagan has come to fulfill the greatest moment in the history of this conspiracy.